after a breach is something that's really important, and it's something that we really need to spend more time thinking about. It's not only the technical response, but also the social technical response that's important. And that is what my talk is going to be about today. So I'm really honored to speak to you here today. So I'll just kick things off now. So you would have seen these circulated, and they'll be available in that there's kind of two bits of outputs, let's say, that contribute to this talk. One is an academic paper. So I am an academic, but this session I wanted to pitch it towards organizations, to management in particular, because the research really is squarely towards you all. So here's just some quick links where you can actually find a preprint of the paper, you can find the official paper, and you can also find a white paper that I've created, which summarizes the work that I'm going to present today. So firstly, let's start off with a quote. So, let's kind of look at the reality of this. And the reality of this comes down to, I think this is a perfect quote, and it really hints on the importance and the reality that today, it's not, the unfortunate reality is that even though we will try to prepare for a breach as best as possible, one of the realities is that breaches happen. We can try our hardest, but we need to be successful all of the time. Attackers just need to be successful once. So therefore, the numbers are stacked against us. And I think the reality comes out with this quote in that, it's really about, unfortunately, preparing for an attack happening. And what do you say, not only technically, but also socio-technically. And let's jump straight into this and look at some examples. This is an example from the UK. So as Sergio mentioned, I'm an academic based in the UK. And you can see, so TalkTalk, a big telecommunications provider, was breached back in 2015. And the article was released, and there was basically some press around it. And one of the kind of key quotes that a lot of people remember is the TalkTalk CEO mentioning, "I can't confirm a customer's data was encrypted." And I think this is really interesting because it does highlight, at that point in time, they weren't sure that whether data was encrypted or not. And I know things have progressed since then. But another thing that we should really consider here is this. So this is not the highest quality image, but one thing I want to highlight here is, this person being very worried about the way how they found out about this breach, and figuring that actually TalkTalk should have contacted them and should have engaged with them more. So this is a really interesting thing, and as it looks around even the impact of social media today as it comes to breaches. Another breach, you would have all, I'm sure, heard about the Equifax data breach, and that was covered extensively in various different news outlets. Some of the more interesting things around it, once again, pertaining to comms, looking at the Wall Street Journal highlighting that it took them 6 weeks to disclose the attack, but also their questions really around how they actually went about communicating with others using separate domain names. There were even some reports saying that they mistakenly tweeted a phishing link, so not the correct link for customers and for stakeholders, anyone impacted. And then there was also, so this is an image from Crowds on Security, and what he mentions based on his research is that if you actually checked whether you were impacted on the phone versus on your computer, you would actually getting different messages. So one was saying you're not impacted, the other one was saying that you may have been impacted. So once again, that highlights and that really kind of emphasizes this reality here about trying to get corporate communications right. And that brings me really to the kind of crux of the question which I want to pose to you today, and which we're discussing today. And that is, what does effective corporate communications and PR look like after an incident? Because it's really important, because when we think about this, we really need to try to figure out, well, what should you say, who should say, what's the best way, how quickly should you come forward? All these things are really, really key, given the impact that they have on stakeholders, and of course, given the impact on things, considering things like laws, regulations, and so on. So the way how I went about this work is kind of in a typical academic fashion. I will stick out the kind of boring academic bits. But the point here is that what we tried to do was we tried to explore what was best practice in research. So basically, what was research saying how you should respond when it comes to data breaches, and what you should say corporately, and what you should say generally to the public, for example, and to customers. And then we also try to look at best practice based on a number of real world security incidents. So these were incidents where a company was breached, there was some mention in the public domain, and we actually looked and tried to monitor what did the company say, how did they say, and how was the response perceived by some security professionals and experts. And then what we did was we combined two of these different areas, So we looked at the academic best practice, we look at industry best practice, we combined these, we evaluated them, we compared and contrasted, tried to extract some best practice guidance. So we're trying to really pull from both fields here, and to try to then develop and evaluate a framework. And the framework is really the thing that we're proposing in this research. So I'll go through just some of those two initial bits, and then we'll kind of go through the framework towards the end of the talk, or to the middle or end of the talk. So in terms of the initial part, just thinking about themes and best practices. So from an academic's perspective, one thing that was really interesting, that academic work focuses or has focused quite a bit on what was the stock market's reaction after a breach. So it's almost the kind of key, what was the knee-jerk reaction? So this company, this organization was breached, what happened in the stock market? And what we saw there was often, of course, there's almost an immediate drop or immediate impact on the stock market. But what we saw was that often in many cases, especially if the company survived, that long-term, the impact would actually tail off, in that you could almost not see it in many cases. There was also a massive emphasis on legal requirements to notify, and this, of course, makes perfect sense. Because when we think about it, there is really, the way how you go about breaches and what you need to respond with, how you need to respond, a lot of this is actually governed by exactly what are the regulations in the particular part of the world where you are in, because they will often tell you, you need to notify by this time, you need to notify these individuals, and so on. Message framing was another big point. That was also about how do you actually communicate a message. There's a massive emphasis on protecting reputation, and probably that's not very surprising, especially given the type of organization you might be. You might be very focused on, well, how do we actually go about and what do we say to protect our reputation? Negative emotions and complexity of outsourced functions is also another thing that I'll come on to a bit later on. But so basically, so from analyzing those kind of key themes in the research, what we then try to do is to try to extract a number of best practices. Like I mentioned before, we were expert academic research just for the fun of it. We were really trying to get to the detail in terms of what are the best practices from academic research about what companies should say or how they should act after a breach. And what we found was that there was one of the key points was this idea of demonstrating a commitment to stakeholders, in that if you've been breached, the important thing is for you to actually be able to first, almost come clean and say, okay, we've been breached, and here is what we're going to do in response. Here's what we're going to do to ensure that we're going to keep your data safe, or that we're going to keep our interactions with you safe or secure going forward. So that was a really key thing, kind of this focus on addressing the problem. A lot of stakeholders expected you to do that. The multi-jurisdictional complexity, like I mentioned before, that was massive, and that's one of the key best practices we try to focus on. In the reality that after a breach occurs, you have to stop and pause and consider, okay, where are the various individuals that have been impacted by this breach? Because of course, you might have individuals across the world, and then what are the kind of legal requirements based on where that individual or those individuals are. So that's also another key component. We also have this idea of message framing, like I mentioned above. It's really important. I mean, I've seen a number of cases where organizations have focused on, let's say, getting the message out as quickly as possible, and the message is framed in a way that only technical individuals can understand it. But you really need to consider who are the target group that you're going after, and what are the key things you want to tell them. So framing, this idea of framing is critical. And really interesting from academia, there was a large focus on blaming the attacker. So kind of almost publicly saying, well, yes, we've been breached, but it was those bad attackers over there. It wasn't really our fault. And then the last one, kind of this idea of beware of the emotional impact. And I think this goes back actually based on the earlier tweet that I showed you above, which actually focused on the reality that some people can get really upset after a data breach. And even if individuals haven't been impacted financially, there's kind of an emotional impact that also is an emotional impact or harm that's also important, which we need to consider. Now, the next thing I want to talk to you about, so we covered the academic side of things. So of course, I'm sure many of you out there are that practitioners, and you really care about what happens for the practitioner side of things. So what we did was we actually, we tried to focus on a number of different breaches. You can see the organizations that we focused on your screen now on the left. And so we looked at various different companies as you see here. And then what we tried to look at was, firstly, all these companies have been breached, I should have said. So we looked at the incidents around these companies. And then we tried to look at, okay, well, here are the incidents surrounding these companies. How have they responded, and how was that response actually perceived by key individuals in industry? And I say key individuals, meaning individuals such as the individuals you can also see on screen. So we looked at Schneider on security, Krebs on security, Troy Hunt, We Live Security, and all of these. We chose these in particular because these are well recognized as kind of key people in the security field, in the security domain. So we wanted to see what was their thoughts on these various breaches. So now jumping directly to the theme, the key things that came out from our analysis. So we recognize that this idea of credibility of statements is really important. So looking at the fact that you have to release statements, of course, but you have to release statements that are actually believable and that don't just almost try to put a plaster on the wound. Next, this idea about downplaying. So one thing we recognized was that in many cases, organizations would try to downplay a breach. So they would say, oh, well, yes, the breach happened, but maybe it was only 1,000 records, or maybe it was only 10,000 records. Well, we actually processed millions of records. This idea of downplaying was not really looked upon well at all. It's almost seen as you need to understand and appreciate that when an organization or individual gives you their data, if that data is breached or lost, you really need to understand the importance of that data to the individual and show that importance publicly. And that also touches on my other point, i.e. this reality of focusing on the customer. The customer is really important as well. Of course, not disclosing and delaying is a massive question. One of the poll questions I'm asking you, one of the key realities is, many of them might be saying, well, yeah, okay, in the case of a breach, do you wait, for example, until you figure out exactly what's happened and don't say anything, even if they're suspected, if people suspect that there's breach, or do you kind of report, publicly immediately? These are all kind of important questions, which we come on to a bit later. Admission of responsibility is another interesting one, simply because that touches on the reality that in many cases, organizations actually don't want to accept responsibility and they want to blame the attacker. But in what we found based on our research is that stakeholders and customers, they actually appreciate it more when the company accepts some responsibility, because at the end of the day, that the data was given to the company, the data was given to the organization to keep, to work with, to secure, and the organization has lost that data. And then this last point about previous data breaches, and this came up in particular when the reality was a company was breached maybe for the second or third time, yet they were still releasing in their statements, we really take security very, very seriously, but that actually acted to antagonize individuals simply because if you take security seriously, how is this your third or second or third breach of customer data? So from those themes, what I tried to do then was extract a number of kind of key best practices, similar to what we did with the academic work before. So here you see kind of 4 key ones that I present. One looks at being prepared. And the point here is that you need to actually have relevant statements that you can actually release and be often beforehand. There should never be a case where a breach has happened and you are now thinking and drafting up from the beginning a statement. You should have kind of templates of statements that you should have prepared. And these should also be based on facts and based on the realities, because people will investigate them. This point of accepting responsibility, this came up as a massive, a large point from the industry focused work. In that this point about blaming the hackers was not really seen as a good approach at all. It just was not seen. This kind of idea of playing victim wasn't seen as a good approach, and actually didn't do companies well in the media. The third one, looking at this point about looking at trying to put active measures in place. So if a breach occurs, thinking clearly about, well, what are the type of ways in which you can actually secure individuals' data, whether it's credit monitoring, whether it's implementing two-factor authentication, anything like that, that can ensure that firstly, you're communicating to customers and stakeholders what you're doing to resolve and to deal with the breach. And then secondly, to actually ensure that they're aware that you're trying to prioritize their protection. That's very, very important. And then the last point, and this is probably the most contentious of the points, so I'm sure many of you will probably catch it with me later to discuss in the Q&A on the website. This point about, so we advertise this kind of, or I should say the industry where advocates rather, notifying customers and stakeholders sooner rather than later. So not taking weeks to notify, but notifying sooner rather than later. And I'll come on to the reason for this a bit later. So then what we did was, of course, we have two sets of best practices. We have academic best practice, we have industry best practice. What should we do? So in many cases, what was great was that academic and industry best practice actually aligned perfectly. So we were able to kind of take these two things and combine them. Then we also had cases where there were different things that were so we had some from academic, some from non-academic that we were able to combine. And then we also had communication and messaging. And then the last point is there's some areas that actually didn't map well. So communication didn't map with, sorry, on the left, academics with recommending that maybe blaming the attacker, industry and best practice maybe suggesting that's not a great thing. So in those cases, we basically tried to pick one that we thought had the strongest argument, and we went, for example, for accepted responsibility. So from that work, we came up with an initial framework, as you can see here. But then what we did quickly was we kind of reached out to a number of kind of key stakeholders, and what we did was we tried to engage with them, and we tried to get their feedback into the research. And here you can see a number of the key individuals. Well, they're anonymized data. So we had 13 individuals, but we had individuals that were kind of very senior in organizations, so chief risk officers, head of information security, CISOs, directors, and so on. And these were largely from security organizations, and you can see some quite large organizations. But also we have some key people involved in this, crisis response. So people that you actually get to call in cases when there is actually a breach. And so we refined the framework based on that. And the framework now is what I'm going to carry you through now. So there are a number of kind of key areas or key steps of the framework. I broke it down into kind of two main areas. There is one, which is pre-event, so what you should do before an event occurs. And then secondly, there is post-event. So in the pre-event setup, what we do is we have a number of key things that you need to establish. So you need to establish, you need to consider what are your priorities after an incident occurs. We need to consider what are the gaps. You need to consider and maintain communication. You need to look at incorporating partners and performing regular testing. And let's see. And this basically just jumps into that in a bit more detail, but I'm just giving you a Whistlestop tour because all of this is available to you offline. So this is kind of in general pre-event what's needed. And this is more information on pre-event what's needed. So in terms of the partners, the communication, the rehearsals, and so on. Then in terms of the actual crisis response, you also have a number of different things you need to consider. So you need to consider, if a breach happens, is a disclosure mandatory? What do you need to consider? Establish what you need to disclose, and so on. So these are some of the key points. There's also the framing the message. So framing the message is already all about accepting responsibility. We suggest avoid downplaying, and also other things such as taking into account age, gender, and different things such as that. And also, as we kind of emphasize here, avoid blaming the attackers. We also need to think very carefully about how you actually choose to disclose. So choose when to disclose and select how to disclose. So you need to be thinking very clearly about when to disclose. So we often suggest notify quicker rather than later because that helps to kind of avoid the offset of people being actually very upset. There's also this idea of direct versus indirect communication. Of course, direct communication has many benefits. So for example, email has many benefits. And surface mail might have many benefits, but there might also be some disadvantages to that which you need to consider. And the same thing for indirect communication, as we kind of delve into more detail here. And then we also have this idea of kind of preparing for reaction in terms of you need to brief staff. There are a number of cases where staff weren't briefed, that the message wasn't delivered well. So these are also kind of key things you need to be thinking about. Keep it simple, avoid jargon, and so on. And this is the last slide, really. And I just want to say very briefly that this work has had really good take up in the information security industry. There's a number of people reached out. We won some awards for this work as well. So we do believe that there's a massive impact and a massive potential for the work. And as much as possible, I'm really happy to to collaborate and to engage with anyone that may be interested. So thanks very much for attending my talk, and thanks a lot.
Hey, thank you very much, Jason. I think this is really solid work, and I appreciate the kind of, it's not just a long academic paper, but you also present the kind of workflows that make it easier for us to create these playbooks. So much appreciated. I recommend everybody goes to Work Adventure, where speakers will actually be available for Q&As, and Jason published his contact details. I'm sure he's happy to reach out if you reach out to him. Thanks a lot for presenting and taking the time.